All right. So hello everyone. In today's video, I'm going to focus on the difference between static and dynamic characterizations. So in debate, you're going to be expected to characterize a lot. And I just want to make a very short distinction between explaining how you get your benefits, which could be explained as a mechanism, or how you get certain things to be more likely than not, as a consequence of what you're doing in the motion and how people will behave, etc., versus the characterizations of different parts of the debate, which could include, certain claims, certain value judgment claims, or certain claims on, related to likelihood on how people would behave, or how stakeholders would behave, or how the world would behave, or certain actors would behave, whatever. But that's relatively independent from, the motion itself most of the time, right? Most of the time. And so the reason why characterization is very important is because, this is a lot of the discipline that you will need in debating, which is that you will need to explain why certain things are true, why certain characterizations or assumptions are true in a particular speech, which would include some of the premises that you will be making, which would be vital points that are part of the argument that you will need, which would include, hopefully, if you've learned to progress more and more in making an argument and you realize that there are some parts that you're overlooking over others, you know that you have to build a lot of stuff. Like, there are a lot of components, and that requires characterization. So if you imagine what an argument is constituted by, think of it as a set of many characterizations that are pooled together to reinforce an argument as its glue, right? A characterization solidifies a certain claim or a certain premise to be more likely over other things. And so when we talk about static versus dynamic characterizations, what I hope to teach today is that we understand when we are making a claim that is relatively more like established, which is unchanging. That is a static characterization that you can't likely change this characterization because there are many things associated with this that are like, or in debate language, that are symmetric on both sides, that are neutral on both sides. That's like, it's motion neutral, right? That you usually hear this in debate when people say that no, there are many narratives that will exist to make people compare themselves against other individuals that are independent of this narrative anyways. Here are the reasons as to why this is true, XYZ. And then you're like, oh, so that's what they mean. They try and neutralize a debate by explaining what is constant, what is static, right? What is static and unchanging, so that they could focus on what is more nuanced and what is the specific mutually exclusive thing in the round later on. So that is a function of a static characterization. And the way that you think about a static characterization is by asking the question, well, what are the established facts and premises that prove this characterization? So a very simple claim would be the characterization of a significant number of eligible US voters typically will not show up to vote on either side for these three reasons. Number one, election day is not a holiday, most voters are independents, and they have other priorities. I want you to notice the way the proof is structured, right? It seems to be very spammy, just giving many reasons, and that is part of the strategy, right? You're giving all of these intuitive reasons that are very strong, that seem to be very established, right? I can't contest the fact that because election day is not a holiday, that now it's very easy for a lot of people to end up voting, because of course it's very difficult for people to end up voting because it's not a holiday. It's very hard for me to contest the fact that most voters are independent, because yeah, that's an established fact. It's very clear that most people are not diehard supporters of political parties, so they don't always show up to vote, and that, they simply have other priorities. And that's very hard for you to say that, people care more about voting over like many of the immediate priorities that they might otherwise have in an entire year. I mean, you could try, you could give all the reasons that you want, but I want you to understand the reason as to why like you end up in a very strong rabbit hole with static characterizations like this is because like this stuff is just like they try and gloss over it in a speech, right? But it's quite strong in explaining that, yeah, you know what? Both sides will have difficulty in encouraging people to vote. So let's focus on this part of the debate, those that really do matter, you know, and then they could focus on that argument. So I want you to understand, even without contesting the claim, right? You understand that the way the argument is structured, the characterization is structured, is by listing lots of established facts and trying to, you know, it's worded in the present tense that it's like established, right? That is a true statement, right? And that this is gonna apply on both sides. So of course, to a static characterization, your incentive is not to just provide all the other reasons as to why that might be true. I mean, you could do that, but at best, well, what do you really do? You really just like deny the claim. You just give other equally true reasons, or you know, I'm not so sure if they're always going to be more overriding than others. You could try and weigh out each and every one of them, but that could waste a lot of time for you. And so you have to immediately go and think, okay, I gotta talk about the motion. I gotta talk about who really matters. I want to see how we can really affect certain people over others. And then I'm going to talk about the motion, even if this might be true, right? This is all part of your understanding of the function of a static characterization in debate, because you shouldn't get bogged down in this like matter fact dumping that makes it very, very hard for you to like, you know, maneuver in a round. But on the other hand, of course, if they try and give many, many, many unrelated, seemingly unproven facts that are trying to prove a certain characterization and they sound so unrealistic, then a static characterization is the very good opportunity for you to just really call out that no, this is not how you apply these facts to the claim that is being made. What is the underlying assumption behind the static characterization? It is that, oh, because election day is not a holiday, it means that people have to care for their work and that employers are going to be XYZ, or, you know, because most voters are independent, it means that suddenly they will only vote if they are part of a political party, when that might not necessarily be true. So don't get bogged down in like the underlying fact itself. I mean, the fact itself, you should understand what is the function, what is the argumentative function of the static characterization and the reasons behind it, so that you could address that later on. Game. Another very simple claim could also just be, it is unlikely that small countries will be able to participate in UN-sanctioned multilateral interventions because they have a weak military force, or they have no UNSC representation, which is a very, 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 sorry, I want to clarify, it's no UNSC, like, leverage representation compared to the P5, for example. And so it's like, okay, that's very obvious. So static characterizations are very helpful because you already clarified the obvious things, but you reinforce it a little bit rather than just making it sound like it's just an argumentative thing, right? Like, oh, I'm making a prediction that no one is going to participate in the UN-sanctioned multilateral intervention, but you need to provide some proof, which makes it easier for you to do the rest of the argument later on. So now you're like, oh, that is why the only individuals who will participate are the ones with the strongest militaries, and that reinforces my argument that they are the ones to conduct the most abuses, which small countries are unable to check and balance themselves against. And so now it's like, oh, so that's why you did this, you know, this fast proof on weak military force, no UNSC leverage and representation, because the static characterization allows you to really just solidify a fact and then move it on the side so that you could go to the argument that matters more later on. So again, thinking about it, how it functions is very, very important. What I want to now move on to is trying to understand dynamic characterizations, which is, rather than just thinking of characterizations as very static and unchanging, that these are established facts, you want to try and acknowledge that, you know, I can't always definitively prove everything. I can't always prove that no one is going to vote, right? That's hard. I can't give 7 million reasons for why that's the case, but I can try and give some of the overriding driving factors and incentives that prove a certain characterization. So at least now I give a platform for me to really give many strong incentives that sound like they are mechanisms in the characterization, right? They are logical pathways that prove a characterization to be true, and it really does reinforce a very strong thematic claim that you are making in the characterization. So I know it sounds like I'm very biased towards dynamic characterization, and that's for good reason, because dynamic characterizations, they're more open for a response, which is true in a round, but also they are very, very, very persuasive when they are done very, very well, because it's not just about whether or not this is true or not, right? It is about whether the underlying incentive is a very strong reason or not. So I hope that difference is very clear, right? A while ago, you would just need to prove that election day is a holiday, like is a holiday, or is like not a really strong related reason and a strong related fact. But now it's like I have to disprove the incentive, the driving factor, which could contribute as many other factors as this, in this context, in this decision. So that's why the language, like a very small shift in language, which you could have done with a static characterization, but sometimes it's not really necessary, because if they're facts, and like the UNSC example, if they're already established, and like you don't really need to give a dynamic characterization there, that's why you gloss over it. But if it's a relatively harder claim for you to really like it's something you really, really need to solidify, and you want to argue this characterization to be true, then dynamic characterizations is for you. So you would say, a very simple one would be individuals default to entering into relationships with individuals that are relatively proximate to them because of the following key reasons. Number one, this saves on dating costs. Number two, it is easier to develop trust with someone that one is already familiar with. And number three, most would like to avoid the risk of having no partner in the long term. And so, do you see how it seems that this shift in language to make it more dynamic and the incentives are very clear? We have standards. Like there are standards that we are now using to be able to prove the claim, right? So the characterization is in itself is not an argument, right? That's not an argument that people default to people that are proximate to them. I mean, maybe you might make the argument later on that these proximate relationships might lead to failure if you were making an argument on that. But when you need to prove the characterization, you would still need to do this rote work. You need to do this this cleaning up, right? And explain why this is true, which includes, giving these reasons for why this is the case. And so here, dynamic ways to explain it, right? The incentive of economic cost, the incentive of emotional vulnerability and trust, and the mechanism and incentive of risk aversion makes it relatively clear that it is a decision that is socially conditioned, that is going to likely be very, very, very inhibited, and it's not checked and balanced in other ways. And so that is why it likely ends up very, very, very harmful for the individuals that are going to be in these failed relationships later on. So if that's part of the argument, then this dynamic characterization reinforces that. Rather than just saying, for example, if you were to say, well, most people end up in relationships that are proximate to them because that is just empirically true, right? That is a static characterization, because you're just saying, yeah, no, I have a statistic as to why that's the case. I can give you a fact as to why that is the case. But you're not giving you're not proving that. Like it's not, it doesn't weigh as strongly in a round, because it's quite easy for Op to say that, no, but there are many driving incentives for people to experiment and explore outside. So now you must respond with dynamic characterization so that you could respond to the underlying reasons as to why something is true or not. Game. The last example would be this one. In a social media debate, you could explain that individuals end up uncritically consuming news on social media because of the following reasons. Number one, media companies have an incentive to publish clickbait headlines to attract viewer attention. Number two, social media has a profit incentive to allow for sensational and exaggerated news for more clicks, so they will not fact check in good faith. And number three, users are socially conditioned to trust sources that are shared by their social circles, reinforcing existing echo chambers. So we're kind of leveling up the way we do dynamic characterization, right? I don't want to sound like that static is like the most basic and it's like the weakest form. Sometimes it is, like what I explained in the cases that I did, but I remember, like, I hope you understand that it's about the function, right? The function of what you need the characterization to do for you in an argument. If it's just a very throwaway fact that's very easy for both sides to neutralize in a debate and they will agree on it, then then just do the static characterization. If it's something that is relatively harder to contest, then definitely make it more dynamic and focus on those incentives because you will need to beef it up. Like in this case, what I'm doing, rather than just talking about, individual, psychological reasons and the emotional vulnerability, economic costs, and one of the decision-making factors of individuals, now it's like, oh, let me give 3 independent sources of pressures that make it harder for individuals to consume news critically. And so now I'm like, okay, social media is profit-oriented. That's why they don't fact-check. So that's like an implication of the underlying reason that is relatively dynamic because it is tied to an incentive. Media companies have an incentive to publish clickbait headlines. So again, there's an implication and there is an incentive, right? The incentive to attract viewer attention and the implication to publish clickbait. And there is the incentive of users to like follow what the herd says and what other people do because they trust their social circles, thereby, again, implication, reinforcing existing echo chambers. So again, we're not making the argument that echo chambers are bad or that uncritically consuming news is bad, but we are making the claim that it is relatively very likely that people do uncritically consume the news. And so now that we've established this fact at the end of the debate, or at the end of this characterization, now we can move on to the argument. And here, I will say that this is very, very difficult for you to disprove, right? It's very difficult to disprove this particular characterization. Because now, even if you were to explain at op that, but people are learning more about social media, that's not necessarily enough, right? Like, you could say that they could learn, but it doesn't mean that they will always learn because the incentives of different actors align in a way that colludes towards giving uncritical news and that the consumption is not going to be productive. And I think that's very, very beautiful, right? That's a very, very clear platform for you to contest characterization, for you to forward your argument, and for you to acknowledge that this is what I need to do. Of course, strategies like this are very time consuming, and that is necessarily the case. You can't just spam through your entire speech and expect that everything is going to be credited and that all the reasons are always going to be equally like sensible and valid and caught in a regular round. But what I do understand is that when you do need to be dynamic, you should beef it up very properly. Okay? So that's pretty much it. Clarifying this distinction between static and dynamic characterization and the way debaters will argue that in a round is very critical to your understanding of, well, did they really prove it? I don't know. How did they prove it? Find out. And then determine what are their underlying reasons as to why that is the case. Are some more relatively static? How are those particular facts and premises contested in a round? Were they relatively more dynamic? And what are the underlying assumptions of this dynamic characterization and the reasons under that, etc., etc. But notice that this is part of the numerous complexities of debate, right? You will never come up with like a definitively true claim all the time because that's just not how the world works, right? Debate always is about likelihood. You're proving things to be more likely than others because you're making arguments that are forwarding something to be more likely than something else. And so that is why acknowledging the difference of the static parts and the dynamic parts is very critical to becoming a better debater. Okay? Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy.